It's nice to get that positive reinforcement once in a while.
Now, how many millions of those have you put on, Paul?
Pardon?
Because this is a presiding mic. Show what you said. Okay, well, it's a presiding.
Oh, good.
Bush and Tony Blair have some embarrassing thing happen. I don't know if I'm.
Take notes.
Oh, should we? Don't care. Yeah, then I'll forget. Or maybe I want it. I don't want it on.
Good.
Oh, okay. And the on-off button is weird.
This is
I
November
teach
12th.
Oh, okay, that's cool.
I'm on the staff of Methodist Center.
I think I can turn it off, actually. I feel myself echoing.
You're.
I'm good.
Oh, great. Great. I teach.
Oh, I can.
One or two classes a year. So I'm usually at the ethics. I love it very much in the studies, but I just sort of been pretty busy over there. Nice to meet you.
So greetings, everyone. We'll get started now. My name is Aaron Willis. I'm the director of the Bannon Forum and the Ignatian Center for Jesuit Education. I want to welcome you all here today on behalf of myself and my co-organizers, David DeCoste in the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics and Julie Rubio at the Jesuit School of Theology. We're really excited about today's event. And today's event is the final in a series of events about the abuse crisis co-sponsored by the Ignatian Center, Markkula Center, and JST. And while this is the end of that series, which began last winter in Berkeley, today's conversation is one step in the ongoing process of dialogue and discernment here at Santa Clara, in the Diocese of San Jose, and throughout the Catholic Church to determine our individual and communal responses to this crisis. And with that in mind, I'm extremely grateful that we have such an insightful group of panelists with us today, and that Maggie has come back to campus to share her own experiences and expertise on the subject. And so Maggie Van Doren comes with a blended background in religion, spirituality, and podcasting. She graduated from Santa Clara University in 2008 with a religious studies major and went on to earn her Master of Divinity at Harvard Divinity School. For several years, she taught high school theology before pivoting into the world of audio storytelling. Since then, Maggie has produced 3 original podcasts: Interfaith Matters, Spilling Royalty, and most recently, Deliver Us, a deep dive into the Catholic sexual abuse crisis and where we go from here. She currently manages podcast development and production at SiriusXM in New York City. And so I'd like to welcome Maggie back to campus and for today's event.
Thank you all so much. It is a pleasure to be here back at Santa Clara. It has been 11 years since I stepped foot on campus, and a lot has changed. So I want to start just the way we started every episode of the podcast I made, Deliver Us, just by having a sensitivity warning. We are talking about sexual abuse. I think it's really important that we pay attention to how we're feeling during this event. If you need to take a break or step outside, none of us will mind that you do so. And I think it's just important to name that in every space that we're talking about this issue. The question at the heart of today's conversation is how we as Catholics can discern a response going forward. Of course, there is not one simple prescription, so I'm going to begin by telling you the story of how I have personally and professionally reckoned with the abuse crisis. And then I'm going to invite our panelists to share how they have discerned their own response. And that will leave us with about 15 minutes at the end to take some questions from you. So if you have any questions during my reflection or during the conversation, please be sure just to note them on one of the note cards that are on the table. And I think Aaron will go around at a few points throughout to collect those cards, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. Okay, so I want to begin with the story of two priests. The first is a Jesuit that I met during my freshman year here at Santa Clara. His name is Father Mark Revisa. I was in the habit of attending noon mass at the mission, and it was usually a very modest crowd, a few students and some members of the surrounding community. And during communion, one of the Eucharistic ministers, who was kind of like a frail person and had this tremor in her hands, she took the communion cup, and as she was walking, some of the blood of Christ spilled on the floor. And she was terribly shaken by this and kind of like clasped her hands over her mouth. And Father Revisa walked over, and he just kind of put his hand gently on her shoulder, and he said a few words. I don't know what he said, but I could tell in that moment that she was consoled. And it was one of the most perfect distillations of God's grace that I have seen in my 10 years of ministry. And it is a memory that I return to over and over. So, fast forward a decade later, I am living in New York City. It is my first year teaching high school theology at all-girls Catholic high school. And it is my job to prepare students to become Eucharistic ministers at the student mass. And this time, the priest is Father Jordan. Now, Father Jordan always seems to be in a hurry, and he's mildly irritated with the rest of us, pretty much all the time. So before the mass, I'm talking to Father Jordan, and he says, how many sacred vessels do we need? And I say, 5 chalices and 4 ciboria, plus 1 for yourself. And then at the time of the Eucharist, he's saying the prayers, and he realizes that we are 1 sacred vessel short, right? This huge student mass. And he turns to me, and he sends me this angry look, and he says, there's not enough for every student minister and myself. And as his face reddens, I can tell that he is livid with me. And I know it's not my fault, but there's no sense in arguing on the altar. So I apologize and ask if there's anything I can do. And he says nothing and just retreats to his seat. Now, this entire exchange happens in front of the entire school community, and I am mortified and very ashamed. And at the same time, I'm really angry that I'm sitting up here on the altar and kind of made to feel ashamed and at this place that has nourished me for so many years. And so as I am sitting there, like tears are rolling down my cheeks, and I'm just looking at these stained glass figures, and I think about Santa Clara, and I think about Father Revisa and my time here, and I just keep rolling that memory around because that's what it took to keep me from walking out of church that day, or from quitting my job, or from walking away from my faith community at large. The late sociologist Andrew Greeley wrote that Catholics don't leave the church because we disagree with church doctrine or teaching. Catholics walk away because of pastoral insensitivities. In other words, we don't walk away from God, we walk away from other people. The story of Father Jordan and the missing ciborium is not a story of child sexual abuse, not remotely close. But it is a story of betrayal. And for me, it marks a moment where it became really hard to separate my relationship to God and the church with my relationship to this individual priest. And I think that this is where many Catholics do find ourselves. Catholics are leaving because there has been a grave rupture in human relationships. And with that, a sacred trust has been broken. So, what do we do? How do we respond to a very personal and a communal betrayal like this one? I've observed 4 ways Catholics are responding. So I'm going to go through some of them now. Sorry, those are my photos from the priest stories. But so these four responses to scandal: distance, minimization, divorce, and recommitment. To be clear, I don't think that any of these are good or bad. I think that they are very natural coping mechanisms and sometimes very valid responses. But I want to spend some time unpacking them because I think that the more aware we become of these forces within us, the more free we get, and the more we are able to discern a response. So I'll go through them. The first is distancing. And distancing is often summarized by this phrase, "it's in the past." And we saw a lot of distancing following the release of the Pennsylvania grand jury report. Many people wondered why the grand jury had retraced 7 decades of clerical abuse beginning in the 1950s, when the Boston Globe Spotlight team had already broken the story back in 2002. And the church had issued major reforms since then. And I was among those asking, what more is there to say about this? And I think that there is value in distancing, or rather, putting the story in its proper context. The Catholic journalist Peter Steinfels wrote an extensive analysis in Commonweal in which he says that the data used to collect the data that the Pennsylvania grand jury report used does not actually match the summary of the report's conclusions, right? So that not every bishop was guilty of the same level of mismanagement or cover-up, although the report claimed that there are these sweeping accusations across the board. So he fact-checks the report against itself. And Steinfeld's article shows that distancing isn't always a bad thing, provided it is used to add perspective and context. But it shouldn't be used to dismiss the urgency of the crisis today. Because for one, this is the first time in several decades that survivors have been able to come forward without being silenced by the church or by the courts. I myself didn't fully get this until I sat down to speak with survivors for this podcast that I made. I drove to a country home in west of Philadelphia in the middle of a very cold January, and I sat down with the 4 Fortney sisters who are featured in the Pennsylvania grand jury report. And I spent 5 hours recording their stories. I met their family dog. They shared a meal with me. And it was only then that I began to understand that for victims, it's really important to tell their story, to name their abuser publicly, and perhaps most importantly, to ensure the protection of children going forward. The second major takeaway is that while most of these abuse cases are decades old, we've never adequately dealt with the ecclesial cover-up, which is why this is now referred to as a twin crisis. If Spotlight revealed the abuse, the Pennsylvania grand jury report, together with the McCarrick story, revealed more systemic cover-up and mismanagement. Okay, so this brings me to the second way that Catholics are responding to the crisis: minimizing. Here I would suggest that minimization is our attempt to contain the problem to a select group of people. So you might have heard this as, "That's not the church I know," or "That doesn't sound like any of the priests I know." And you would not be wrong in saying this. When I read the grand jury report, the abuse crisis felt totally distant and foreign to my personal faith community. And in order to resolve this cognitive dissonance, I quickly divided the church into two camps: the leaders who failed us on one hand, and the true people of God on the other. This, I would suggest, has become the default strategy of most Catholics, and not just about the twin crises. Maybe you've also felt the need to qualify your Catholicism. It usually begins with the phrase, "I'm Catholic, but," right? "I'm Catholic, but I don't believe this or that. I'm Catholic, but I don't practice this or that." And in some cases, we really do have to create some healthy boundaries for ourselves. But in the case of the abuse crisis, nuancing or compartmentalizing the problem can slip into avoidance. We don't have to deal with the problem if we believe that it's happening far away, in Boston, in Pennsylvania, or among a small minority of clerics who are nothing like the priests that we know. But here's what I realized. The church that enabled and covered up the abuse of thousands of children is the same church that teaches us to honor the dignity in everyone. And if we're going to claim belonging to part of it, we have to claim belonging to all of it. The challenge of a mature faith is to integrate the good with the bad, to recognize the Father Revisas and the Father Jordans, to hold the sacred together with the broken, and ultimately to see the church as all of this. And in this time of scandal, I think we also need to call evil by name. So that means confronting Catholic leadership, but it also means confronting how we, the laity, have enabled an environment of clericalism, how we've avoided scandal, and how we've looked away from those most wounded in our faith community. In short, I think we need to own this issue. The third response is divorce. And by divorce, I mean something that ranges from publicly disaffiliating to not attending Mass or participating in a faith community, and it could be anything in between. Okay? So for the first episode of the Deliver Us podcast, I spoke with Melinda Hennenberger, who is a veteran Catholic journalist, and she had written publicly about her decision to leave the church. And I just want to play a clip. It's a very brief clip from the podcast. And this is Melinda kind of explaining her decision to leave the church.
I feel that the failings of the human institution was in between me and Christ. I feel like it was a real obstacle to my faith. I don't want to go to Mass and think about how mad I am at the bishops. If I identify with it, to me, at a certain point when it's not changing, when does it cross into the line where I'm enabling this? It's like a politician saying, I approve this message.
Yeah, it sounds like you are responding with a very personal sense of moral integrity. You know, that like to practice integrity to your faith and to honoring human dignity, right, which is cornerstone to the Catholic faith, that you can no longer be complicit.
That's exactly it. That is exactly it. I can no longer be complicit.
Okay, so Melinda expresses something that I hear a lot of Catholics saying, which is staying feels like an endorsement. And this reasoning, it doesn't just apply to the abuse crisis. We hear versions of it all over. Does remaining in a patriarchal institution mean that I'm endorsing sexism? Does when the dignity of so many LGBTQ Catholics is undermined, and by other Catholics, does staying make me complicit? And I must admit that this question of solidarity, of who I will stand by, it gnaws at me. It's also clear that for Melinda, remaining would have been an obstacle to her faith. But for me, the church, however broken, was still more grace than shame. And just like Andrew Greeley pointed out, if I were to leave, it wouldn't be because I disagreed with the teachings of my faith, but because of human failings to actually live by it, which meant that there was something worth fighting for. And so the fourth and final response is to stay and get to work, which I define here as recommitment. Recommitment is exactly what Pope Francis called for after the Pennsylvania grand jury report. In a letter he wrote, "Every one of the baptized should feel involved in the ecclesial and social change that is so greatly needed, and that we are never completely ourselves unless we belong to a people." And I have found that to be true. I am not myself without these people. And so I am committed to justice and healing with and for them. Okay, so I want to pause for just a second and ask you to think about these 4 responses and to try to identify where you found yourself gravitating lately. Are you distancing, minimizing, divorcing, or looking to recommit? Perhaps it's just a combination of these. I myself have gone back and forth at various points in time, right? So just make a mental note, and if you have any questions or about those 4 responses, you can write it on the card. Okay, so after having intellectually kind of worked through these 4 responses, I still did not know exactly what to do with the recommitment. After the grand jury report, I had started to read up on the crisis, and I realized that I was 17 years late to the conversation. I remember emailing David Gibson, who's a veteran Catholic journalist, and he's written scores of articles and a book on the crisis, and I said, hey, can you just catch me up? Right? There's so much here that I need to learn about. And then honestly, for all this talk of community, I've never been a model parishioner. I had bounced around between different parishes in New York City. I had never signed up for any church committees. And so I didn't feel very connected to my church or my diocese at the time. So I really thought, who am I to be talking about church reform, right? A commitment to ongoing church reform if I haven't been plugged in. So I had a lot of questions and I had a lot of self-doubt. And in these moments, I behaved like most people in scripture being summoned. I looked away, I bargained, I thought of a long list of people better qualified to do this job. And yet I was haunted by the voices of survivors. And I can remember getting off the subway in Brooklyn one evening and kind of taking this scenic route along a park and looking up at this bright full moon. And on that walk, I heard what was an answer, and it was as crisp as the autumn air. And the answer was, this is the community that shaped you, that loved you into the fullness of being, and it's really suffering. And you can't abandon these people in their time of need. So take everything you know, everything you've been given, and make it work. That's it. There was no blueprint for a podcast. There was no contract with America Media. And yet I knew with perfect clarity that I was being called. And when I look back at that call, I'm reminded of one of my favorite poems by Christine Rogers. She's a poet I met here at Santa Clara 12 years ago through a Jesuit friend. The poem is about the Annunciation, so please forgive me in advance for comparing my podcast epiphany to the call of the Mother of God, but here we go. It's called When the Word Was Made Flesh. Before the angels broke into a song over a field of shepherds, before the splendor of the star transcended the majesty of the heavens, a young girl from Nazareth quietly said yes to a thing she only partly understood. But her willingness was her magnificence. This we know and marvel at when we recall how he first came onto us. Her willingness was her magnificence. She said yes to a thing she barely understood. That line lingers with me. I said yes because ultimately I didn't need answers. I needed affirmation that I had what it took to get the answers. And I do believe that in the course of our lives, we all experience annunciations or invitations to participate in the healing of the world. And if these calls are anything like we read in Scripture, they are terrifying, and you'll never feel as though you're ready, and there'll be lots of good reasons for avoiding the call. You don't even have to say yes right away. You can waffle. You can negotiate for answers. But I do think the most important thing we can do in response to a crisis like this is to listen. Hopefully it's clear by now that I don't think this is a black and white issue with easy solutions. And as I mentioned, I've personally traversed through all 4 responses at different points, sometimes doubling back. But if I may be so bold, I will just conclude on this note. All right. Instead of distancing ourselves from the crisis, we can choose to listen to survivors now. Rather than minimizing the scandal to just accused priests and bishops, we can own this as a kind of in-house problem. And finally, in place of divorce, we can recommit to looking after one another as a family through justice and reconciliation and reform. Thank you. If you have a question, please put it on the cards. We're going to transition to a conversation with our panelists. And I do want to say that, my work on this issue has been made possible by this podcast that I made with America Media. But one of the greatest rewards of that podcast, that entire project, was that it put me in conversation with people who have been invested in the trenches with this issue for decades. So I'm really grateful for the chance to speak with our panelists now and just deepen that conversation that we've started. So I would like to take the time to introduce our panelists. Sally, who we have on the end here. Sally Vance Trembath, many of you know, is an ecclesiologist who teaches about the church at Santa Clara's Religious Studies Department. What you might not know is that from 2003 to 2004, Sally served as the vice president of Voice of the Faithful, one of the first organizations of faithful Catholics to respond to the abuse crisis when it broke in 2002. Catherine Wolf comes to us with a great swath of experience in Catholic education and ministry. She's been a teacher, a therapist, director of the Root-Based Center here at Santa Clara, and a Catholic chaplain at Stanford. She also brings insight into how the church deals with sex abuse allegations today as a member of the Lay Review Board at the Diocese of San Jose. And finally, Father Paul Crowley is a Jesuit and systematic theologian who specializes in theologies of suffering. In 2015, he was appointed editor-in-chief of the esteemed journal Theological Studies. But perhaps most importantly, Father Crowley was one of my favorite professors at Santa Clara and introduced me to the best of Ignatian thought in his course on the Jesuit greats. So in the interest of time and a super focused conversation, I've asked our panelists to keep some of these responses brief, and then I also have some questions in which they can kind of elaborate. So I'm going to hop up on stage. If you guys have questions, write them down on the cards, and then we can ask them at the end. Okay, can you all hear me? Yes? Okay. Okay. So I'd like to begin just by gauging your response to the reflection I offered and kind of where you have found yourself in terms of distancing, minimizing, divorcing, recommitting, or even what you think of those thought categories. And anyone can start.
Go for it, Sally. I think the 4 categories are, they reflect the experience, my experience of being around people dealing with the abuse crisis. I think you do a very good job of describing a spectrum.
And I think that most people have engaged in a little bit of all of those activities. My one pushback, as I said to you before, is this call to lay people to own that it was going on, that we had a responsibility for it to some extent. And that does make my blood boil, because I don't know a parent or grandparent, anybody who loves children, who would ever conscience what went on. And so when you minimize, you say, I'm not saying it's simply a clergy problem, it's a systemic problem. I suppose there's some way in which we lay people have enabled that. It's very difficult to say how. And in my efforts since this whole thing began at least 35 years ago, I've never, ever had any effect from the things I've written or the words I've spoken or the programs that I've put on. I've never made an effect with the institutional church. So I hate to be gloomy about it, but when you say lay people take responsibility, a lot of us have for a very long time.
Yeah, and I think it's really important when we talk about lay leadership, lay responsibility, to delineate sort of culpability when we're talking, and in this case, like the culpability of abuse or of cover-up, right? That I don't think there are many lay Catholics who have been culpable for those things, but to think about an entire family or a faith family or a community, and to say that we all contribute to a certain culture, right? And for better, for worse. And one of the things that has emerged in the podcast as I speak to people is a culture of clericalism that we can very unconsciously contribute to. And so I think taking ownership often means acknowledging where we might be contributing to that clerical culture.
Oh, yeah, I would like to kind of bounce off that. I'm with you, Catherine, and I have far more experience about this than I actually wish I had.
Yeah.
And I don't say that to be a creep or something, but I know far more about have spoken with lots of victims, and the hardest victims for me were the moms, were the adult mothers who didn't know until their child was an adult. That'll change the way that you think about damage. So I agree that I don't think that the lay community directly contributed. That said, unless the whole church, because I'm going to push back a little bit about lay and clerical, unless the whole church starts and says, we have to have pastoral teams, full stop. No more non-team parishes, service organizations, departments of theology. No, we have to form teams that serve the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so that would be the way that I would push. We didn't have a team model for the last several decades, so I'm not going to blame
Millennia?
Yeah, true. But we have to stop that. And just another thing that I would say is that to kind of pivot out of the crisis itself, we have the map for doing that in the documents of the Second Vatican Council that we don't pay attention to. So we have this crisis that is going to be the long now, but we were just we haven't even begun to implement the blueprint for the Church of now. So that's how I would respond to that. But I'm with you, Catherine, that it is not the fault of the people who were deceived by the institutional church. Or another way to say that, nobody tells you to figure out if someone's lying to you. And that to me is what, if I could say just sort of one thing that I've been saying as an ecclesiologist, I wish we could change the name of this crisis. It's the lying crisis. It's the bishop's deceit crisis.
Father Crowley, did you want to?
Well, I'm not sure how I can respond directly to everything that's been said already. But I will say this, that I can remember becoming aware of the fact that there was a problem in the church back in the early 80s when I was reading Jason Berry. And this was before I was a Jesuit. And I suppose at that time I was probably minimizing it just a bit, saying this isn't the church that I know, it's not the experience that I know. But on the other hand, I did feel very acutely even then that things were not being said, things were not being investigated. I don't mean crimes per se, although that's obviously part of it, but I meant more deeply what kind of a church we are, claim to be, and also a lot of assumptions that we may make, theologically laden assumptions about human sexuality, the value of celibacy, and so forth. All of these were already popping up in my mind. I was in Boston at the time all of this broke. I was teaching at Weston Jesuit School of Theology at the time. I remember even before the Boston Globe broke the story, I was reading the Boston Phoenix, which is sort of like the Bay Guardian. Is this Bay Guardian still published? I'm not sure. And they had a full expose, a series of articles there before the Boston Globe actually even opened it. And I must say that when the Boston Globe series was published, I felt this horror and panic, frankly, as a priest, because every morning I would go into the kitchen and open up the Boston Globe, and there was another glaring headline, and it was traumatizing, deeply traumatizing, because I had committed my life to this path, and there was an awful lot of stuff being said about priests in general. I think there were a lot of claims being made about a great divide between the clergy and the laity. There were a lot of aspersions being cast on gay clergy. All of these things culminated in what for me was a reaction of great sadness and demoralization. And I don't think that I was alone in this. And so I had to gradually ask myself, how am I going to kind of recoup, as it were, and function? And I think that I've been through and continue occasionally to go through virtually every emotion that anyone else has, including deep anger and distrust and so forth. Attended the first meeting of the Voice of the Faithful at Heinz Convention Center in Boston out of solidarity with the church, the people of the church, mostly lay people. I don't think there were many other people who were ordained who were there. And gradually I came to a conclusion not dissimilar to what Maggie has come to, which is that this is the community that nurtured me. I was fortunate enough not to have been ever victimized, but I had a great love for, and do have a great love for our faith, and for the sinful church that tries to carry out the work of the gospel. So this latest phase, which began even before the Pennsylvania Grand Jury report, kind of broke open some old wounds, I would say. But I'm, on the other hand, have experienced enough of life between 1980 and now that I think it's a little bit easier for me to place everything that's happening, not just in the church, but in the world, within a broader existential and faith context, if you will, and to carry forward, to do the work that I need to do. And one of the things that has really occurred to me is that in the reactions that have been so paramount, so much a part of our echo chamber, so much has been driven by what is very understandable anger coming out of a sense of very deep betrayal. Betrayal not just of trust, but of faith. I get all of that and have experienced all of that myself. But I also believe that we cannot stay in the echo chamber of anger, and that we have to now undertake the responsibility of looking at the deeper underlying matters that have not really been addressed deeply enough. And this gets us into theological territory, and that's where I decided to, given what my fundamental vocation is and also what little time I have in life left, to devote myself to in this crisis. And Maggie is right. This is more than it is. It is a crisis for the victims, and the crisis for the victims is a crisis for the church as a whole. It is also a crisis of lying and the cover-up, no question about that. But it's a larger crisis. It's a deeper crisis. It's an ecclesial moment in which any number of other questions related to this have been brought to the fore. And so maybe we can talk about some of those.
Yeah, I asked everyone to think about how they have discerned a response to the crisis, and Father Crowley has already discerned kind of a theological response given his existing vocation too. Can Catherine and Sally, can you just explain how you dropped into this crisis and actually how you discerned your level of involvement?
I find it hard to actually call it a crisis because it's been going on for longer than we know. We know 35, 40 years. We don't know what came before. I first became involved in this because I was a therapist in upstate New York in the 80s. And for 12 years, I worked in an ecumenical pastoral counsel center. And at least a third of the clients that I had were people or family members who had experienced sexual abuse. So I have a deep knowledge of what this experience is and how difficult the healing process is, and how deep the betrayal goes. While I was doing that, I had a priest Jesuit brother who and I were always in conversation about these things, and I was also an avid reader of the National Catholic Reporter, so I knew about Gilbert Gautier in Louisiana and James Porter in Massachusetts. And as a matter of fact, in 1987, the first really kind of semi-national conference on sexual abuse of minors was held in Syracuse, New York, and it was put on by Catholic Charities of Onondaga County. So everybody who would say to me thereafter, "Oh, we didn't know," I would say, "You're either lying or you've been really irresponsible in not finding out about this." So I don't brook that. Okay, we knew. The professions knew, the church knew. And it took a very long time, a lot of prodding by people like the great irascible Dominican Tom Doyle to make them come around to at least to the Dallas Accords. But I have to say, I've not been a therapist, in the years since I came back from New York. But I've been involved deeply in the church as a chaplain and also as somebody who's convened a group that meets several times a year in my house. And these issues and a lot of the ancillary issues, because we're talking about a whole web of things, have been what we have discussed and held each other up in our distress. And we've had bishops and we've had theologians and all kinds of people come and talk to us and written, etc. And I have to tell you, the last time we met, right after the whole mess exploded again last fall, was that we had reached the end of what we thought we could do. And that it was their time to actually come around. I think last fall was a real turning point for a whole lot of people who were really hanging in there. Sure was for me. I mean, I hear about these people in Finn and Nienstadt, and these people who were kind of along the way screwing up. And I'm on the review board for this diocese, and things were really getting better. And it's an exemplary board, and we've done good work. I can say that without qualification. But that thing, it really all hit the fan again. And I don't know, it really kind of broke a lot of people because we thought we were getting somewhere. We thought people were waking up. And then we find out McCarrick, this guy Bransfield, dear God.
Sally, how did you become invested in the issue?
Well, it's interesting because to ponder it that way. So I'm going to take Paul's lead and I mean, I was trying to be an ecclesiologist when all this stuff was bubbling up. So, I mean, I was in graduate school, and that's what I wanted to be. I wanted to, work with Richard McBrien, and that's what I wanted to study. But before that, when I graduated from, when I started college in 1972 and said to my little Catholic college, professor, where there wasn't a theology major, that I want to be a theologian, he said to me at a good little Catholic school, you can't be a theologian, Sally. Be a high school teacher and make sure that those girls are a nice girl like you. That's a quote. Okay, so, but I also had other, I don't know, doesn't matter where it came from, but there was a little seminary there, so I could take classes in theology. And I just thought, okay, well, I'll do that. And then, fast forward a few years, and I end up in the summer session at Notre Dame, and I get a wonderful theologian, Mark Searle, may he rest in peace, who says to me, you should be a theologian. Okay, so I was in the midst of the crisis of the church, right? Not honoring ministry, not, saying to me that because I was female, I couldn't serve the church. Okay, so I came into another form of that same kind of problem in the church, where you have the institution actually getting in the way of the two prongs that it seems to me that the church, that are the most important features of the church, right? So our liturgy that feeds us, right? Our sacramental life that feeds us, and our service to Jesus' gospel. I mean, those are the two most important things about the church. And the church is the center of gravity that helps us, that pulls those things together. Well, when this thing gets corrupt, it has an impact on both of those other things. So there was a way in which, because I had that experience of corruption, of lack of honoring my vocation, it wasn't, I just landed in a deeper pool of that. And I'm not minimizing the difference between me, taking 10 years to become a theologian and somebody being sexually assaulted. I'm not minimizing that. But I'm with Paul that, we were just at the beginning of the institutional church saying we have to reimagine ourselves. And that's why I made the reference to Vatican II. The church did reimagine itself, and the church was very aware of how, at that time, the institutional church had come to identify itself with the kingdom of God rather than serve the kingdom of God. Well, we have all the tools for doing that, but we hadn't even begun to implement it. And then this, terrible situation explodes on us. But all that other work also needs to be addressed. And that seems to me that's where I am, is that, the liturgy and service will save us. As long as we have people who are serving the gospel, who we feed with good liturgy, because we cannot live without good liturgy as people who serve the gospel. That's non-negotiable, right? But we also are not a little lifestyle enclave where we have our perfect little liturgy and we find our little, place that we go and we feel good about that. We have to serve the wider human community in terms of Jesus' gospel. We need to reinvent that, just the same way that, Paul invented it the first time, and then but we're in a process that seems to me of reinventing.
Yeah, so I want to dig a little bit more into your specialty, Sally. And the question I have for Sally is the church capable of reform, right? As you said, we had this reimagining at the Second Vatican Council, and are we able to actually live into that? And what do you think that personally and collectively, communally, we can do to issue in that reimagining or those reforms?
Okay, when a teacher gets a question like that, which is like this,
I know, it's really big.
yeah, no, it's a great question. But this is my little tactic. You run home to mama, and my mama is Karl Rahner. Okay, so I mean, because it's a huge question, and I do think that Rahner, our great Jesuit theologian, has a real insight here. Is that the church, the church is just entering a new phase. And if we were to actually think about the church as being quite young, we haven't been around, so our first phase was to really that really tiny period of time when, right after the resurrection. And then the church, that's the first phase of the church. And then the second phase is when the church says we're going to be a global church. We're going to marry ourselves to, if you will, to the Roman Western tradition. He says that's the second phase. Well, the third phase is when we finally decide we're going to be a global church and we're going to enter into this new world where we take seriously developmental psychology and we aren't a transplanted church, but we actually grow up from the roots of Latin America and the Asian community. So we actually do that. Well, we've just started that. And so my answer to your question is yes. I mean, this is a terrible situation we're in, but we've been here before. We can survive this. But we have to do the same. But it is a crisis. It is a crisis in that it goes to the root. We have to reinvent. We have to reimagine how we keep those two activities, feeding our sacramental life and serving the wider human community. And what does the institution that helps us, that stabilizes that work, we have to reinvent that, or reimagine that. Reimagine, not reinvent.
So Catherine is on one of San Jose's diocesan lay review boards, and I know that these review boards have been one of the advancements that the Dallas Charter has made. We also see the church now at least cooperating with state investigations, and yet, kind of despite these advances, there is still a pretty pervasive mistrust of the church and even its capacity to be fully transparent, right? So, Catherine, if you don't mind speaking to that concern that the church is incapable of being transparent.
Another very big question. I hope so. My experience on the review board has been terrific, but we had a bishop who believed in what we were doing, and he listened to us and gave us authority and populated the group with a whole spectrum of expertise. And so I can speak very positively about that our response in certain circumstances, and there haven't even been very many, thank God, it has not only been to care for the victim and their family and to rectify the situation, but also to take, in terms of legal and procedural matters, but also to be very pastoral in how we dealt with them, but also pastoral in how we dealt with the abuser. And that's a whole other subject that we could go into. But I don't know, I think one of us Santa Clara theologians that came to talk to our group said he wasn't quite sure that the institutional church had the capacity anymore to effect change, to bring it about from top down. And I hope that's not true, because I do watch Francis, and I do think that his move towards synodality is a very important move. It sure is rubbing a whole lot of people the wrong way, which is probably an indication it might be effective. But it's a move towards being more dialogic.
Yeah. Can you define synodality? Just
well, it's really to kind of contrast it to what we usually think of the institutional church as being hierarchical, bureaucratic. It's really, the emphasis is more on listening, as you call for, and dialogue, aimed at building collegiality, possibly even consensus. And I'm thinking of you, maybe we're brand new, because I think we've got to go right back down there. Right back down. I think of the things communities I've participated in my life, which have taught me that it is the effort. We must make that effort, but we have to have the proper leadership, which may be the form of leadership that leads from behind rather than on top. I was part of a charismatic community that went kind of nuts and took over in a very hierarchical fashion, and they all left and moved to South Bend. It was crazy stuff. I was part of a wonderful Vatican II parish in upstate New York with 400 of us and a beautiful priest who they left in the parish for 30 years because he was the only one who could deal with that. We had community conversations at least once a year. We had lay people preaching. It was an extraordinary experience. So I know it can happen. And I was even, I think it's alive. I think the energy is out there to be captured. I was at a conference in Chicago just a month ago of the Catholic Literary Imagination. Almost 400 people talking just like this, and they're the people who are imagining us forward.
Can I interrupt just for the sake of time? And I think you're probably already getting to it. And a lot of the questions that we've received from all of you, I think you can answer, each of you. This question is, what are 1, 2, or 3 things, so maybe 1, 2, or 3 things that we as lay people should focus on, right? So like, kind of what can be a lay response? And if you could think about that from your own respective areas and specialties.
Well, I'll go quick in one sentence. Don't put up with bad liturgy. Don't stay.
And what is the connection? I know good liturgy is central to the health of the church, but can you help make that connection between good liturgy and responding to this issue, the abuse issue? I don't want to call it a crisis since that feels like an inadequate term, but
Liturgy forms you. Liturgy forms and feeds the community. And my children are in their 30s, and a lot of their friends are getting married, and none of them are getting married in churches. And that's not just Catholics. They're not getting married in churches. And all my friends are like, oh my gosh, my kids have all grown up Catholic. They're all gone to SI, and they're not getting married. They're not getting married in the church. And part of that is because they're not going to put up with bad liturgy. And so they would like to be a part of a thriving parish community. But you can bet that they would like to baptize their children, but they're not going to do it in a place that doesn't take them seriously as leaders in their parish and as a place that feeds them. So they're going to find it other ways. So that's what I mean. We liturgy and service will save us, but we have to have both. We have to have ways for especially young people to form communities around serving Jesus' gospel. Because if we don't do that, they'll go to the Giants game, right? But we also have to have, right? We also have to have liturgy. We have to have sacraments that are visible signs of God's hidden presence that feed them on a regular basis. And if we don't have them, they're not coming.
Well, and I think it's no coincidence that I began this talk kind of in liturgy, right? Talking about this kind of sacramental moment of grace and then a sacramental kind of experience of betrayal. So I think that there's actually a lot to what Sally is saying in there. Paul, Catherine, what 1 or 2 things, maybe one thing for each of you that that the laity might be able to do?
To do.
Or to think about or be invited into, I know.
Well, the first thing that occurs to me is that all of us need to think about all what we're going through at any moment in some kind of broader historical framework and context. And quite honestly, when I look around this room, one of the things that concerns me is that there are so few people below 25, shall we say. And I hate to be ageist because I'm, being ageist toward myself. But what I'm pointing to, I think, is a problem. And I think that if we want to use the word crisis, part of the sense of crisis is, if there is a sense of crisis, it's generally held by people who, roughly my age or somewhere in that vicinity, who invested a great deal of hope in the church after the Second Vatican Council especially, and who managed to somehow live through the last 40, 50 years. And then this latest set of revelations sort of took the cap off, and all sorts of pent up frustration and anger came pouring forth. And I think that's one of the reasons why we don't have a lot of people under 25 in the room, because that has not been their experience. Their experience is of a very different church, and they've grown up also in a very different culture regarding religion and the role of religion in life and in culture in general. I'm really heartened that Maggie, who is a millennial, I believe, right? You qualify as a millennial, is spearheading this. I know a number of other millennials who are have entered into the life of the church through these recent events, but I think are really probing and asking the sorts of questions that are somewhat different from what people of my generation, I hate to do this generational hermeneutic, but in this particular case, I think it helps, might be asking. I have a lot of hope in the upcoming generations. I know they'll make a lot of horrible mistakes too. They're human. But in terms of opening up new possibilities for us in the church, and if you want to talk about laity, then I think that's where we should be looking. I would also say it should be intergenerational, as this certainly is. But the real challenge for us as a church is to vitalize the faith in the lives of people who are, young. I have to say this, I really think that we're at a very different place in the, shall we say, kind of phenomenology of faith today than we were certainly 40 years ago. I think there is much more on the part of younger people, a search for what, for want of a better term, I might call the mystical. And there's less patience on their part with the politics of the church. There's less interest in that. And so I think that people who are, in my kind of position in life, need to take our own blinders off and see this, that there is this crisis going on, yes, but it's going to be, whatever the reality of the church is going to be perceived very differently depending upon when you were born. That to me is one of the biggest challenges that this has unveiled for me.
I just think it really is sort of concluding what I was speaking about before in terms of trying to form much smaller communities. I love the term communities of moral deliberation. But I think it does come back to the beyond within, which Houston Smith talks about in his World Religions. I just spent the last 5 years writing a book about the afterlife from the point of view of lots of different faith traditions, and have interviewed literally dozens of believers. And I have to say that it has been an extraordinarily buoying experience for me. I have been so uplifted by the faith of these people, some of whom come from traditions that would seem to be radically different from ours, and we get talking to each other, and we are absolutely speaking the same language, and we have great trust and curiosity and community with each other. And so, oddly enough, having been one of the sort of gloomier speakers up here, I have found if there's a way of kind of, we're down, a way to kind of touch bottom and get off, it's what you were talking about. Perhaps, as Karl Rahner said, the Christian of the 21st century will be a mystic, or he won't be a Christian at all. And I do think that we really need to go within, and we need to renegotiate our engagement and our sense of membership, what that means in the Catholic Church, but remember what a huge family we're part of.
Yeah.
And not just the community of people on earth, the whole cloud of witnesses.
If
if I may just jump in here, in making Deliver Us, I reached out to all of the listeners of the podcast to hear what people were doing across the United States and actually across the world. I think we got some submissions from Scotland, just to hear what people were doing in their local parishes, universities, faith communities. And I do have to say that the responses there were really inspiring. That I mean, one of them I featured in the last episode. It's a parish in Georgia, St. Thomas More. Immediately following the 2018 revelations, they started hosting these listening sessions. The listening sessions involved into a leadership crisis action committee that is still going strong. That committee has been talking rather effectively to the bishop, and they've been working kind of incrementally to improve their relationship to the diocese, but also kind of chipping away at this crisis. And so much of that is really emotional work, right, for the community. But those were 2 or 3 individuals at St. Thomas More Parish that were able to make a rippling impact in their community, and which I hope can set an example for lots of communities across the United States of involvement, of engagement, and some form of recommitting. So I think we're out of time. Is that right, Erin? Thank you all for being here. I'll stay around after. I'm sure everyone else is very busy, but if you have any questions about the podcast or something that we didn't get to answer, I will be here. All right, thank you.
So thank you all for coming, and again, thank Maggie, Father Crowley, Catherine, and Sally for all being here, and we'll hope to see you at future conversations on campus or elsewhere. So thank you very much.
Congratulations, Maggie. Your good work. Good work.
You are the best. Great to see you. Oh, yes. Yeah.
Yes, Jen. I mean, I'm so excited. It just makes me happy to see it. I said with happiness.